Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. I said it is not often that we get a really big story of really big consequence in mid-May. And it's funny because Tuesday night I could not record. I was actually prepping some stuff for when producer Matt and we will be off, not next week, but the week after, first full week of June. I will be traveling. I will be on a beach, mimosas, whatever. But I was preparing some stuff, thinking we won't go live on Thursday, but let's be honest. What does it really matter? What kind of story, or Tuesday, what story could possibly break on a Tuesday in mid-May? Then I wake up. Then, in what was clearly an orchestrated media blitz, because ESPN, On3, 24/7 Sports all had it at the same time, Billy Napier and the Florida Gators football program is being sued by former 4 to 5-star quarterback, depending on what recruiting service you looked at, Jaden Rashada. This story is wild. And so I want to go ahead and dive in because I have a lot of thoughts on this. But the theme of what I want to talk about is pretty straightforward. One, I want to tell you what you need to know. But then two, and this is as important, I want to explain why I believe that, frankly, Billy Napier, in my opinion, might just be, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, quite possibly the worst college football hire that I can personally ever remember. That sounds like hyperbole, but I don't think it is when I lay it out for you. First of all, details of the story. And what is the story again? An SEC football coach being sued by a former recruit. Okay, so Jaden Rashada, it's funny because I actually remember talking quite a bit about this story as it happened in real time. Really 3, 4, 5 different updates as far as the Jaden Rashada stuff was concerned. First off, even the summer going into his senior year was kind of weird. He was trending towards Florida. Then he goes to Miami. He commits to Miami. Florida fans freak out. They're not happy with Billy Napier. This is before he has ever coached a game, by the way, at Florida. Florida fans aren't happy with Billy Napier. They're trying to figure out what's going on. It's clearly NIL. Miami dropped a bag, whatever. Then, of course, a few months later, in the middle of the season, mid-October, Jaden Rashada flips from Miami back to Florida, and all seems well. That is until National Signing Day, when there's a weird situation even on National Signing Day. If you remember, Billy Napier had to postpone his press conference on National Signing Day because of the fact that Jaden Rashada had not sent in his letter of intent. And so basically, Jaden Rashada was kind of the crown jewel of the class. And basically, Billy Napier didn't want to go to the podium and not be allowed to talk about the best recruit in his class because, again, you can't talk about a recruit until they are officially signed with your program. So that happens. And then from there, Jaden Rashada signs. Jaden Rashada is announced as part of the Florida Gators class of 2022, I believe it was. And then, oh, by the way, of course, just weeks and days after he is announced as part of the class of 2022, Jaden Rashada, it ultimately turns out he does not enroll at Florida. He does not show up at Florida. The Florida Gators release him from his letter of intent, and he goes to Arizona State. So that was what we knew at the time. Then, after all of that, The Athletic does the huge story, the huge expose on everything that happened in the recruitment. And really, I'm not going to go through the whole Athletic situation, but they got basically the contract that he was supposed to sign with Florida. And frankly, maybe even a contract that he did sign. They just never paid him for it. And the contract that The Athletic came up with, how about this? Jaden Rashada, who was not even like the best quarterback in that class, that was the same class as Arch Manning, a couple other guys. Jaden Rashada was supposed to get $13 million. I sound like Dr. Evil. $13 million from Florida as part of that deal with the collective. It ends up falling apart. But the Athletic gets that contract. And so basically he was supposed to get 13 million. He ends up going to Arizona State. He gets none. And that was kind of the end of it. He goes to Arizona State. He plays a little bit as a freshman. And as it turns out, he actually transfers this offseason to Georgia. Kind of a little bit under the radar. If you follow college football, if you have a lot of interest in the sport of college football, then you kind of see he ends up at Georgia. It's one of those situations where he will back up Carson Beck this year and then be in position to replace him next year. So that was where we were at with Jaden Rashada. That is all of the background until Tuesday morning when we find out that Rashada is actually suing Florida and Billy Napier over basically everything that I've told you. And I'm not going to give you every single detail from the lawsuit, but essentially what you need to know is this. Remember when Johnny would get a new this, or Billy would take a vacation, or Stevie would do that, and your parents would come back and you say, Mom, I want that new pair of sneakers. I want this. I want that. I want blah, blah, blah. And what will your parents say? Just because Johnny has it, just because Billy has it, just because Stevie has it, doesn't mean that you need it. And what they would always tell you is sometimes in life, when something seems too good to be true, it often is. And that's really how I feel about this Jaden Rashada situation. Because essentially why he is suing Florida, and I think rightly so, is because basically everything that he was promised during his recruitment, Florida did not deliver on from a financial perspective. And so what Jaden Rashada is basically saying is that essentially that what he was promised cost him other NIL opportunities at other schools. And so he feels like, you know what, I'm suing for lost wages essentially at other schools. And so what did Florida offer? Why is he suing right now? Well, first off, there's a few things. One, as I said, he originally committed to Miami. As we found out, Miami basically gave him $150,000 right around the time of his commitment. So that ends up happening when he flips his commitment from Florida to Miami. Florida promises him $500,000 to flip. In other words, basically, after he commits to Miami, he takes a couple visits to Florida, and Florida's basically director of player personnel basically says, Rashada family, what do we need to do to make this happen? What do we need to do to get you to be a Florida Gator? What do we need to do to get you to be in that orange and blue? And the family, gives them a number, whatever. And they say, okay, no problem. We'll give you $500,000. Well, it never comes. Then as we get towards signing day, as I said, Billy Napier, weird signing day because they're waiting for Jaden Rashada's letter of intent to come in. It never does. And basically the reason why is for two reasons. The Rashada family never got the $500,000, and the contract that they were promised that would owe him $13 million also doesn't show up. And so basically the Rashadas are like, dude, what are we doing? We're not signing anything. Then here is the crazy part. How about this? Billy Napier personally, according to the lawsuit, gets on the phone with his player personnel guy, the guy that already promised him $500,000 that never came, and says, this is the head coach. This is an SEC head coach, Billy Napier. Tells the Rashada family, I personally guarantee you we will get you $1 million ASAP, but we need you to sign today. Head coach gets on the phone, promises $1 million. They sign, and the money never comes. And so essentially, again, this is why Jaden Rashada is suing. It is because he had an offer from Miami on the table. Now that's reported to be about $9.5 million, which is crazy in its own right. But basically the Rashadas are like, we lost out on all this money because you promised us money that never came. And as we found out as part of this lawsuit, how about this? The Rashadas, the only money they ever received from Florida, remember they were promised $13 million. All they ever got was $150K, and that was to repay what Miami had already paid him. So essentially they gave him $150K to give to Miami to essentially get out of his NIL contract there. Comes to Florida or commits to Florida, signs with Florida, never gets a dime. And so the Rashada family said, enough is enough. We're suing you because this is nonsense and we lost out on a lot of money. So those are the details. I know it took me 15 minutes just to get the details out, but they were important. And what I want to do now is talk about the consequences of what this all means for Florida, what it all means for the future of NIL. But let me start by saying this. I think really I have two big takeaways about this. The first is that this confirms something I thought about NIL, but then I want to get into Napier. Okay. So, first off, my first thought is this finally answers a question that I had about NIL basically from the second that NIL started. Over the last couple of years, you would read a lot of stories about players or collectives or whatever, and players were promised a certain amount and they wouldn't get it. And so players would be offered $800K to sign at XYZ school. And then you'd find out they got 100 or 80,000 or 70,000 or whatever. Or they'd be offered 80K and get 10,000, whatever it was. But I kept hearing all these stories about all of these different deals falling through and players not getting what they agreed to. And I kept asking all of my sources in college sports, I kept saying, can you explain to me how that is? Like basically, if I work for Fox Sports and I sign a contract and they promise, let's just use round numbers. They promise to pay me $100,000 a year to host a radio show Monday through Friday, or ESPN or NBC or whatever. I'm just using Fox, but whatever. If I sign a contract where they promise $100,000 and I live up to my end of the contract, I show up every day, I'm responsible, I'm ready to go, they have to pay me whether I have the best show in the world or the worst show in the world. And so I've never understood, how can these collectives just not pay what they promise? And this kind of answers it. They can't, and Jaden Rashada is the first of what I believe will be a lot of lawsuits. Now, ultimately, I don't know how many there will be, but I think we'll see more, because you can't just promise, you can't just get kids to leave a good situation for your situation, or you can't just get kids on your campus by saying, we're going to offer you XYZ and not deliver. Now, you can do it on the field. You can say, I'm going to offer you a starting spot, whatever, football, basketball, baseball, whatever. But when it comes to monetary stuff, if you sign a contract, you have to, be good on that contract. And so I never understood, even when the basketball portal really kind of picked up over the last couple months, I started asking people, like, how can a school just offer a kid $250K or $500K or $2 million like Great O support? Like, you have to deliver. And so this explains, and I think this is the first of what will be not just one, quote LeBron, not one, not two. I think we're getting a lot of lawsuits here in the coming years because these collectives in many cases are not living up to their end of the bargain. But two, from the football perspective, let me say this. Billy Napier is a disaster. And it's funny, everybody thinks, oh, Torres doesn't like certain people in the industry, and Torres is critical, and Torres is this, and Torres is that. No. But Billy Napier is an abject disaster. And it's funny, I was talking to somebody about this, but sometimes when stuff is happening in real time, you don't realize the historic significance around it. It can be a positive or a negative. I'll give you a positive example. I remember during UConn's NCAA tournament run this year, a buddy of mine, Nick Coffey, hosts, radio in Louisville. He texted me, he's like, Torres, I hope you're enjoying this Dan Hurley stuff. Dan Hurley is going to go down as one of the great coaches in the history of college basketball. He said people don't see it now because it's happening in real time, but he will. And so this isn't a UConn Dan Hurley conversation, but it kind of struck me. It's like, yeah, because we're living in the moment, we don't really realize just how great Dan Hurley is. But the inverse is, I don't think people realize how bad Billy Napier is in real time relative to what the Florida historic standard is. And the crazy thing is, this is the thing that, to me, if there's a theme from this situation, it's pretty clearly this, is I believe, I hate to say this, like, I don't know the guy, but it feels to me like Billy Napier has lost his way. Okay. Producer Matt, do you have the pinned tweet on Billy Napier's Twitter account right now? So this is the pinned tweet from the day that Billy Napier agreed to be the Florida Gators football coach. He said, the culture precedes positive results. Champions behave like champions before they're champions. They have a winning standard of performance before they are winners. That's from the great Bill Walsh. And so why I pull up that tweet is because, in my opinion, Billy Napier has gotten so far away from who he is and what he's about. If you follow this guy's career at Louisiana Lafayette, and I know people don't like calling it Louisiana Lafayette, it's the University of Louisiana, whatever. But he was all about culture, culture, culture. It's about the student athlete experience, and it's about this, and it's about that, and we're going to do this the right way, and we're going to build it from the ground up, whatever. And maybe that was his intention when he got to Florida with that first tweet. But ever since this guy got to Florida, all it's been about is NIL, NIL, NIL. And I get that we live in an NIL world, but I think he's kind of lost his way. It's funny. I even remember, like, before he coached his first game, I remember him doing some sort of press conference, and somebody asked him, they're like, the reports are that I think it was University of Texas. It's like every player at Texas is getting this much or that much or whatever. And he's like, actually, that number's wrong. It's actually significantly higher. And I remember that striking me in the moment of like, wait a second now. This guy's worried about what's going on everywhere else instead of worrying about what's in his program. And what we are seeing now is the results. And what we are seeing is one of the worst coaching performances ever relative to the school that he is at. So as an example, this is what Billy Napier has done in his first 2 years at Florida, okay? Went 6-7 in year 1, 5-7 in year 2. That doesn't sound that bad until you realize this. Florida had never had back-to-back losing seasons since the 1970s before Billy Napier arrived. Now, in his defense, he took over a bad situation from Dan Mullen. They actually were under 500 the year before he got there. So Florida is in the midst of its first 3-year situation where they're under 500 since the 1940s, okay? But the first time back-to-back seasons under the same head coach since the 1940s as well. They went under 500 in back-to-back seasons, but that was during a coaching change in the 70s. So just from that context, Florida is historically bad under Billy Napier. But from there, there's being bad, and then there's being bad in the manner in which he's been, which is both historically bad on the field, but also embarrassing off it, okay? Because I sent out a tweet on Wednesday when this story, or Tuesday when this story broke. Producer Matt, do you have my tweet from the other day? So this tweet I sent out, I think we got it here. Give me 1 second. We'll get it loaded up. But essentially, I put out a tweet. I said, I think this is the worst regime one of the worst regimes that I can ever remember. And I got some pushback, and people were mad. And I don't think we have the tweet, but there it is. It's okay. Well, the College Football Report basically paraphrased my tweet. But long story short is, and I dropped something here. Give me half a second. But the long and the short of it is that you can see the tweet here. And Producer Matt, you can go ahead and drop it. I thank you for that. But when you look at this regime, it is not just the win-loss record, but it's the manner in which they are losing games, okay? So it's not just that Florida's losing games. It's that they're every time they lose, it is in the most embarrassing fashion possible, okay? It's in the most embarrassing fashion possible. Go back to last year. Think about the losses. What were Florida's losses? You lose opening night at Utah. Remember, Utah's a third-string quarterback. That's not the bad part. But you lose on a crucial play in which you only have 10 men on the field in special teams. You lose to Kentucky. That's not embarrassing. Kentucky has improved its program. But Ray Davis rushes for 280 yards against you in that game. 9.5 yards per carry. Kentucky averages 10 yards per carry in that game. You lose to Arkansas. Remember, Arkansas fired Dan Enos, their offensive coordinator, a week before. They have a bye. They come out of their bye. They beat Florida in the swamp, okay? So we think, oh, maybe Arkansas has turned their corner. No, they lost every game after that. They got blown out by Auburn a week later. And so you start looking at these losses. It's not just that Florida is under 500, but think about these losses. You get destroyed by Kentucky. You lose to Arkansas at home, the first time Arkansas has ever won in the swamp. Oh, by the way, it was their only SEC win. They got destroyed a week later. By the way, LSU, remember the LSU game? That was basically the game that Jaden Daniels basically won the Heisman Trophy. That was the game that Jaden Daniels had, and this is going to sound like a made-up stat, but it's factually accurate. 606 yards of total offense for Jaden Daniels in the win by LSU against Florida. You have on top of that, by the way, you lose to Florida State, good team, but third string quarterback at home. That's not totally embarrassing, but that's a game you probably should have. So I could go on and on. But the point is, you're losing on the field in embarrassing fashion. By the way, 2 years before you get blown out by Oregon State in a bowl game, you lose to Vandy in Billy Napier's first year. And so it's like, where are the good wins? Like, where is anything positive? But then on top of that, you're embarrassing off the field too. Like, it's one thing if you just don't have a very good product, but you can tell that the organization and everything is going in the right direction off the field. That is not the case at Florida. Remember, before National Signing Day a year ago, this past year, so December of 2023, remember, Florida got to as high as number 3 in the recruiting rankings. Then they lost like 4, 5, 6 marquee players right before signing day. Nasir Johnson, defensive tackle, was committed to Florida, flips to Georgia. Jamonte Waller was committed to Florida, flips to Auburn. Flipped to Auburn, by the way, during a Florida game. I seem to remember Hugh Freeze kind of going to the press conference, giving a wink, wink, nod, nod, something good is coming. Amaris Williams, 4-star defensive lineman, flips from Florida to Auburn. Wardell Mack, defensive back, flips from Florida to Texas. Xavier Filsamy, that was the kid's name. Wardell Mack was another kid, I believe, that flipped earlier in the cycle. But I just bring it up because it is just so embarrassing. And it's not just that you're losing on the field, but you're embarrassing off the field. Now you're getting sued by a former recruit. It just speaks to me like total chaos. By the way, when I put out that I believe this is one of the worst tenures ever, people started throwing names at me like Butch Jones, Jeremy Pruitt, Ron Zook, whatever. You know, Butch Jones had a 9-win season. You know, Jeremy Pruitt, for all his faults, had an 8-win season at Tennessee. You know that Ron Zook actually had back-to-back 8-win seasons at Florida. By the way, split an SEC East title. By the way, at least he signed a number 1 recruiting class that set up Urban Meyer for a championship run a few years later. So listen, I could go on and on. This isn't Bash Billy Napier Day. But you just talk about embarrassing. It doesn't get much more embarrassing than being sued by a recruit. Things are not good in the Swamp.